everyone. I'm Rorry Daniels. I am Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I'm here with Danny Russel, Allison Hooker, and Ankit Panda to unpack the latest news from Northeast Asia, namely this week's summit between Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korea's Supreme Leader, Kim Jong Un. This is the second such high-level meeting between the two leaders in the last year after Kim Jong Un traveled to Russia's Far Eastern region last September. And the meetings are markers of a growing relationship and perhaps strategic partnership between Russia and the DPRK. This is obviously underscored, if not accelerated, by Russia's continued war in Ukraine, by the Western sanctions in response to that aggression, as well as occurring amid a backdrop of highly strained inter-Korean relations, with South Korea also having expressed support for Ukraine, and Seoul's renewed interest in a longstanding U.S. objective of bringing its key allies in Northeast Asia, South Korea and Japan, closer together. And of course, in the background of all of this is the highly charged strategic competition between the U.S. and China. So a lot of relationships are shifting at this moment. I'm speaking here to Allison Hooker, who is Senior Vice President of American Global Strategies and former Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asia at the NSC, who covered, among other issues, Donald Trump's meetings with Kim Jong Un. I also have with me Danny Russel, Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute and former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, and Ankit Panda, who is the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as author of the book, Kim Jong Un and the Bomb, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. I want to start by asking each of you to reflect on the events of the week. Starting with Allison, what struck you as most significant about this latest Russia-DPRK summit and its outcomes?
Thanks, Rorry, and great to be with you, Danny and Ankit, and thanks for the opportunity to join you on this week's events. I think the thing that really stood out to me, just looking at the pomp and circumstance of Putin's visit to Pyongyang, was Kim's confidence. I think we're seeing a growing confidence in Kim. The deepening ties with Russia certainly is giving him options. I know we're going to talk about China later, but options beyond Beijing in terms of who Kim is dealing with and what kind of goods and services he's getting through those engagements. And we're definitely seeing that with Putin. Seeing that with the relationship with Russia. In that vein, it struck me that Putin brought his aerospace chief and also his Minister of Energy with him on the delegation. I think that points to certainly interesting ties, increasing those ties in the future, perhaps more advice for Kim's satellite programs. And certainly the energy issue will interest Kim going forward, looking at other ways to maybe supplement the goods and services he gets from China. So those were, I think, I'd start with that and leave it there for now.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good high-level take on what North Korea might be prioritizing out of these meetings and how Russia is delivering on some of those strategic priorities. Danny, over to you next. Give us your high-level impressions. What struck you the most this week?
Sure. Well, building on what Allison said, I think first and foremost, it's the extent to which North Korea is benefiting from Russia's problems, benefiting from the sharp deterioration in relations between the West and Russia, and frankly, the West and China. And Pyongyang, I think, is gaining much more than just food and energy and technology from this comprehensive strategic partnership deal. Putin, for example, is now providing a lot more political cover, kind of insulation from sanctions to North Korea. The visit does certain amount to kind of launder North Korea's international reputation. Admittedly, its reputation isn't very good, but it's kind of normalizing North Korea's status and more worrisome, normalizing North Korea's nuclear program. So here we have a PERM 5 member actively condemning and subverting the very resolutions that it voted for, that it's committed to enforce. And as Allison said, I think it's a big windfall for Kim also in the sense of having new options with Russia that diminish Chinese leverage, gives him more room to maneuver. But for me, there's a second takeaway that I just flagged, which is the signal of increased Russian activity in the Far East. So Putin not only went to North Korea, but he went on to visit Hanoi. And, look, magnifying the threat that North Korea poses is hugely concerning in its own right. But on top of that, if what we're seeing is a Russian move to, in effect, open a second front in Asia to up the threat, not just to South Korea from the DPRK, but the threat against Japan also, since this goes hand in hand with an uptick in the tempo of Russian military naval drills in the Sea of Japan and around there. I think that the Far East dimension of the visit is quite concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you've highlighted kind of two big themes that I hope we'll unpack a little bit more. One is, what's the future of global governance if we have P5 members that are not on board with the rules that have been put in place? And then secondly, what's the bigger Russia strategic play in Asia? Is there one? Is it actionable? And does this Russia DPRK partnership, a growing partnership, is it tactical or durable and strategic enough to give Kim more cover in Asia through, Putin's authority and own objectives? Ankit, give us your take. What do you think? What were you watching this week, and what is striking you that you're thinking about now as we look to the future?
Absolutely. I mean, so, to fully endorse everything that Allison and Danny have said, I'll just add that what strikes me about this is how openly we sort of see everything really coming out of the two sides. When Putin and Kim met at the Vostochny Cosmodrome last year, they did hold their cards a little bit close to the chest on specifically the contours of their cooperation. Now, I mean, just look at the photographs coming out of Russian state media, out of the Kremlin, out of Nodong Shinmun. I mean, this is openly being celebrated as an act of prominent statecraft by two leaders. The text of their treaty is rather detailed. We'll perhaps get into that in just a moment, but it explicitly mentions cooperation on space, peaceful nuclear energy, to sort of go back to some of the non-proliferation concerns that I'm sure we'll get into in just a second. So I find that striking. And the other point I want to make, Rorry, is just I think a really interesting question that sort of relates to the second question that you just asked is how much of this will be dependent as a function essentially of Russia's short-term priorities in Ukraine. Because I also want to draw attention to the comments that Vladimir Putin made in Vietnam after his visit to Pyongyang, which came after news that South Korea was considering revisiting its policy on arms transfers to Ukraine. And Putin, of course, said that he doesn't rule out arms transfers to North Korea, and that he could enable these kinds of arms transfer deliberately pursuant to their strategic partnership agreement that was concluded in Pyongyang. So what's interesting there for me is that I think I sort of have a theory of Russian foreign policy right now that suggests that everything that Russia and particularly Putin is doing essentially subjugates all other Russian interests, including traditional interests in non-proliferation, global governance, global order, to short-term priorities in Ukraine. And so I think for Russia, potentially assisting North Korea, allowing Kim Jong Un to accelerate his nuclear ambitions, is a new form of leverage. I think Putin recognizes that this is part of the United States' interest in Northeast Asia. I think he's wrong that it's going to fundamentally reorient U.S. policy towards Ukraine and assisting Ukraine. But I do think Russia is trying to find additional levers to apply pressure on the West. So I think that is a parallel factor here. So that's the broader strategic context. But I do think that despite this, we are seeing the start of a broader recalibration and the end, essentially, of the post-Cold War Russian approach to the Korean Peninsula, which was once a policy of strategic equidistance broadly between Seoul and Pyongyang. Yes, Russia did support sanctions against North Korea, but they engaged with Pyongyang. They had ambassadors in both Seoul and Pyongyang, of course, for a number of years. Now I think Russia has explicitly oriented itself towards North Korea and views North Korea as a fundamental strategic asset rather than a liability.
Yeah, I saw actually that I think Seoul called in the Russian ambassador this week to speak a little bit more about some of the comments that were made, probably in both Pyongyang and Hanoi. But absolutely appreciate the attention there to the optics as well. I mean, I was struck by watching Kim Jong Un and Vladimir Putin, kind of laughing in a car together, like carpool karaoke or something. It does strike me that this is, it's really speaking to some of the more propagandistic, pop culture-y ways in which these leaders present themselves to their people and to the world. Speaking of a certain level of comfort that perhaps was not had before. I absolutely do want to get into some of the contours of this, including the specifics of the defense treaty that was revived, a long dormant kind of mutual association treaty that was revived. But maybe, Danny, you could help us think that through in the context of U.S. interests in the region. Ankit's already alluded to, the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea and the kind of bigger strategic threat that this type of defense treaty could pose. What's your read on the treaty itself, and where does this leave U.S. interests, maybe both in Northeast Asia, but also in Eastern Europe, as this does seem to be explicitly linked by Putin himself to U.S. and South Korea's support for Ukraine?
Right. Well, it's hard to evaluate the durability and the seriousness of a piece of paper signed by two Leninist dictators. History doesn't provide definitive indicators, but we certainly need to take this very seriously. Russian DPRK collusion is, obviously bad for U.S. and Western interests on both ends of the spectrum, on both fronts, in Europe as well as in Asia. It doesn't require a whole lot of explanation. It's pretty self-evident that every shipment of munitions to be used against Ukraine and every bit of technology that's shared with North Korea is just magnifying the security problems that we face in each of these two regions. I very much agree with Ankit that Russia is trying to use North Korea's leverage and deterrence to provide coverage for its war in Ukraine. And as he said, this partnership agreement seriously degrades UN counter-proliferation efforts, which is an important U.S. interest. We're going from a stalemate in the UN Security Council, which was bad enough, and a weakening of the resolutions, which was bad enough. But now, as I said, you've got a P5 member actively subverting the effort. So it's magnifying the risks. It's exacerbating these two security challenges. It's clearly a setback for U.S. interests. Now, U.S. interests, Western interests are still to push back against aggression, to defend the lives, the sovereignty, the territorial integrity of the countries being threatened. So there's no change in our interests. There are, of course, a whole host of questions about what our options are and what we can and should do about it. But I'm sure you'll get to that question.
Indeed, I absolutely will. Appreciate that. And to, start thinking a little bit about how these two countries have been pushed together by Western sanctions, even though Western sanctions may be the only appropriate or the most effective or least escalatory way to deal with state aggression. They do kind of create this pocket, this bubble where states that are under extreme sanctions do kind of seek out and reach out for each other. Allison, I want to turn to you and ask a little bit about the effect of the summit and particularly this mutual defense agreement on South Korea and inter-Korean relations, South Korea domestic politics. I mean, I feel that this is, the treaty language is very carefully worded. It's, only in the event of an invasion would the two powers kind of bring to bear equal and respective, military pressure. But obviously that seems very aimed at the US and South Korea. I'm not sure if there's any other country that the DPRK feels a threat of invasion from. So walk us through a little bit how this looks in Seoul and maybe particularly in the context of a very divided and partisan South Korean domestic political scene.
Yeah, thank you. And Seoul, obviously it's deeply concerning. As you mentioned already, Seoul has called in the Russian ambassador today. And, I think it in terms of just starting with the view on the inter-Korean relationship, it was deeply divided, and that the rift deepens further between North and South. As you see, North Korea running towards Russia. I think there's a bit of just thinking about South Korea, Russia for a moment. There was a hope that, thinking, and Danny will be familiar with this, thinking, 10 years ago or maybe less, South Korea looking at railway access through Russia, through over to Europe, and also just thinking about different connectivity in the region and wanting to have that. And this also kind of further dashes those dreams. But I think that's what we're seeing in Seoul reaching out to Russia. They really don't want to see that relationship disintegrate in the way that it is. But back to the inter-Korean relations, it definitely deepens that divide. And thinking about domestic politics, I think it further complicates Yoon's term, obviously. I mean, thinking about the April elections and the losses he had there, this is going to fuel the opposition's criticism of Yoon, showing that the relationship with North Korea off the table, but things are getting more and more tense, more and more dangerous. And so I think that reflects, in many ways, reflects on Yoon, fuels the domestic political tensions there in South Korea. I mean, in terms of, thinking about what South Korea does, I mean, I think it does push the trilateral relationship. It increases the importance of that, elevates the alliance with the United States. And, we're not talking about domestic politics here, but, that also, I think, heightens concerns about what happens with the U.S. alliance after November and into the next year. So all of this, it just increases uncertainty is the bottom line. We're already living in a very uncertain and tense world, but I think this just adds to it. I'll stop there.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that there is so much uncertainty in politics this year, so many elections happening around the world, but then added on to this deep, deep discord between the major powers of the world, an ineffective global governance regime. And in the midst of all of that, smaller countries and sometimes very aggressive countries that can play all of these dynamics off of each other to their own benefit. Ankit, I think I'd love to hear a little bit from you about the implications of this relationship on North Korea's nuclear program. I mean, I think that the heart of the problem that the U.S. has on the Korean Peninsula, starts with North Korea's development of nuclear weapons. Where are we with this today? And how is this burgeoning Russia-DPRK partnership relationship affecting, North Korea's development, pursuit of a greater, stronger nuclear program?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for analysts who look at this, I think it's very easy to let the imagination run wild and just imagine some really horrifying situations where Russia entirely throws caution to the wind and decides to fully abet a North Korean nuclear buildup, which is underway. Kim Jong Un is in the process of a 5-year plan of military modernization. While I don't think we should dismiss some of those worst case scenarios in our analysis, I think a more evidence-based approach for the moment suggests that the kind of transfers we might see will still at the margins help Kim Jong Un accomplish a lot of his modernization objectives, but I think they'll be unlikely to mount to anything that I might really call a game changer. And part of this is really due to the fact that the North Koreans themselves over the last several decades have been rather effective, even in the days when the Russians would enforce sanctions and actually interdict some kinds of illicit technical transfers from within their borders to North Korea relating to military activities. The North Koreans did make quite a few advancements. So it's not like the Russians at this stage will really be able to help the North Koreans cross many of the key thresholds simply because the North Koreans have already done that. But there's I think a lot of concerning ways in which this cooperation can play out, right? A lot of the focus of so far in reading the new Russia-North Korea treaty has focused on Article 4, which includes the mutual defense provision, which you referenced, Rorry. But Article 10, I think, gives me a lot more concern because that's where there's explicit references to cooperation on space, which, of course, was open when Putin and Kim met last year in Russia. They met at a cosmodrome, a Russian spaceport. I also suspect the recently failed North Korean space launch may have incorporated Russian technologies. But it also references peaceful nuclear energy, right? And that, of course, is a very plausibly deniable way for Russia to assist North Korea in ways that might actually have some serious implications for Kim Jong Un's plans to size up his nuclear arsenal, right? North Korea is pursuing both qualitative and quantitative modernization. And on the quantitative side, Kim has talked about exponentially increasing the size of his nuclear arsenal. Now, I don't take that literally, but I do take it seriously. And so we might imagine, for instance, Russia deciding to transfer to North Korea more advanced centrifuges for uranium enrichment. The North Koreans have largely relied on centrifuge technology that they sourced through the AQ-Khan network in the 1990s from Pakistan. The centrifuges will do the job. North Korea has been producing uranium for a number of years now. It's easy to imagine the Russian assistance substantially accelerating the rate at which North Korea can begin to amass fissile material, which is going to be very useful for Kim Jong Un as he seeks to expand his nuclear forces. Naval nuclear propulsion is another area where we might imagine cooperation. I could also see the Russians justifying that kind of support with cynical reference to U.S.-Australia cooperation in the context of AUKUS. We've already seen that in certain international settings where Russia has been critical of the United States. So those are, I think, some of the ways in which this could manifest. But I don't want to underrate actually conventional military support, which I actually think is far more likely, right? So this includes revitalizing the Korean People's Air Force, which relies on obsolete Soviet-era airframes, but with maintenance and spare parts from Russia and new airframes. The Air Force could become a lot more capable, not capable, of course, to sort of meet parity with the U.S.-ROK alliance, but it could complicate our military planning. Same goes for assisting North Korea with better rocket artillery systems, surface-to-air missile systems, radars. This would essentially change a lot of the assumptions in our conventional military planning for the alliance in a way that would significantly complicate, I think, how the United States and South Korea would have to think about managing a crisis with North Korea. So there's a lot of ways in which I think this will substantially challenge U.S. and South Korean interests. I think right now we have to be vigilant for the possibility of really Russia opening all kinds of technical pathways to North Korea. But, Rorry, you talked a bit earlier about how durable this will be, and I do still think that there's an element of leverage on both sides here. I think as long as North Korean assistance to Russia remains incredibly valuable, Pyongyang will be able to receive certain kinds of irreversible technology transfer that will be extremely valuable. But I don't think Russia will necessarily be volunteering to transfer everything in its toolkit to North Korea without a quid pro quo from the North Koreans, essentially. So I'm watching quite closely for evidence of where these transfers might go. I do suspect when the North Koreans do succeed with another space launch, we will potentially see evidence of transfers from the Russians on space launch technology specifically. I do think the two sides will hold other forms of cooperation closer to the chest. As we saw, the North Koreans have publicly denied that they're assisting or transferring munitions to North Korea. So they still don't want to be too open about that precisely. But as I said, I was struck by how open all of this is in the text now. So we might see a change going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So for you, this is still like in the realm of the transactional, not transformational yet. But I myself worry that some of the habits of building cooperation, including making good on the implementation of some of those treaty items, do start to build toward a deeper, more durable, more substantive relationship over time.
Well, just to clarify for a second, Rory, I mean, I do think that this is a broader strategic realignment. To the extent that it is transactional, I do think it's on these areas of technical cooperation. I mean, I think this applies to even our own alliances. We're sometimes fairly transactional with how we transfer technology to many of our closest partners as well. And I think for the Russians and the North Koreans, it's going to be a similar dynamic, even as they continue to diplomatically and politically build their ties into a strategic partnership that I do think will be fairly durable.
Okay, so headed down the path of perhaps a stronger strategic partnership. Danny, I want to turn to you on China. This cannot feel very comfortable for Beijing right now, which has long seen itself as kind of the major leverage holder over North Korea, though, of course, oscillating on whether or not it wanted to use that leverage for any one specific purpose. How do you think this is all being received in Beijing, which of course is like building its own no limits partnership with Russia, but still sees itself as like sees itself as the stronger player in both China-Russia relations and China-DPRK relations. How does it feel to officials in Beijing?
I was just in Beijing, and although it was prior to Putin's visit to Pyongyang, it was very clear to me that senior Chinese officials are unhappy with the relationship that they have now with North Korea, unhappy with North Korean behavior. And I have no doubt that the outcome of the Putin visit to Pyongyang is exacerbating that discontent. This 2014 is the 65th anniversary of DPRK, PRC relations. It's the year of friendship and so on. There ought to be a lot of high-level party-to-party engagement. But what I have seen and what I was told in Beijing is that, in fact, the contacts have been pretty minimal, have been basically pro forma. I think we know that Xi Jinping himself hasn't shown an unrestrained affection for Kim Jong Un. I think the Chinese leaders see him as a pesky troublemaker who's a little too big for his britches. I know they have an unfavorable view of hereditary succession in a Marxist socialist paradise. As you point out, yes, Moscow and Beijing have, throughout their history, sort of vied for influence with North Korea. And so, yes, there is clearly discomfort over the comprehensive strategic partnership that resulted from the Putin visit. But I think that this isn't really a matter of sort of great game or historical rivalry so much as the issue is the hit that Chinese leverage over North Korea is taking from the opening of the relationship that Pyongyang now has with Moscow. I mean, Pyongyang was already taking advantage of the US-China strategic tension that pretty much guaranteed that there was no circumstance in which Beijing would align with the US in any move to constrain or punish North Korea. Pretty much guaranteed that China was going to have to bite its tongue, if not actually back up North Korea, if the DPRK did things that the Chinese weren't too crazy about. But now being courted by Putin, whether it's only as long as Putin's need for North Korean munitions to use in Ukraine lasts, or whether it's more durable than that. I think we don't really know yet. But in any event, it gives Kim much more room to maneuver. It makes it much easier for him to disregard Chinese interests. So a North Korea that has more impunity, that has more running room, just isn't going to be responsive to Beijing's preferences and its asks, and frankly is more likely to precipitate a crisis, to create chaos on China's border, which is the last thing that Xi Jinping and the leadership want. We're seeing, incontrovertible evidence that they're looking for external stability at this particular moment. So I think that all of the indicators are that this is a serious setback for Chinese interests.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you're making toward the end there about the Chinese need for stability, contrasting with the kind of foreign policy of Russia that Ankit described as being relatively volatile and escalatory. The type of, if you can call it foreign policy, at least policy and policy moves that Kim Jong Un has made as well to kind of sow chaos in different places. So I think Beijing is really stuck in a tough corner right now. If what it is seeking is stability, it does not have partners that are going to enable it, co-opt stability on their own for it. And if, as you say, Russia is kind of moving into a bigger strategic play in Asia, that also cannot feel very comfortable in Beijing right now. So we've talked quite a bit about what is happening, how you three as experts in this region see it. I'd like to get into what can be done or what should be done, if anything, to respond to this. So Allison, I'm going to turn to you. What can the U.S. do now to maybe both by itself, but also with its allied network to manage this kind of new dynamic in Northeast Asia? Please give us your thoughts and recommendations.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think we continue to do what we're doing. I mean, the past 3 years have been about strengthening the trilateral ties even further than what they already were. U.S. we talked about it a little bit a few minutes ago, but U.S., South Korea, Japan, not just the security relationship, but our exercises, our collaboration, our cooperation, all of that needs to continue. Information, intelligence sharing, et cetera, continue to build on that. I think sanctions are a controversial topic, and I continue to think about this. But at the same time, I continue to advocate for stronger sanctions, not just on Russia with regard to the war in Ukraine, et cetera, but also secondary sanctions on China. And even though I completely agree with Danny that this cooperation between North Korea and Russia diminishes to some degree the leverage that Beijing has over North Korea in particular, but also over Russia to a certain degree. Even still, I think we could look at secondary sanctions against China as a way to get them to use the leverage they do have, or at least to push them into action on this issue. So I think we definitely need to continue to build what we have in terms of security relationships in the region, and not just the trilateral ones, but we just had the Philippines, Japan, U.S. trilateral, and there are other relationships in the region as well that we should continue to build. But a lot more of what we have been doing is needed in the first instance. I also, I know you'll turn to the others for that same question, but in thinking about the South Korea the complications there. I think we can't rule out the fact that South Korea continues to move maybe more rapidly towards its own nuclear program, and we have to figure out how we feel about that in the U.S. and in the alliance context as well. But I think this definitely, the deepening relationship with Russia kind of pushes them in that direction, and that becomes part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's turn to Ankit on that very issue. Ankit, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what this development means for the larger nuclear non-proliferation regime, but also if you could just speak a bit to the effect of the defense treaty of the scientific cooperation on allied perceptions of the U.S. Do you think this development kind of undermines credibility in U.S. extended deterrence in the region?
Let me start with that second one because I think it's a more straightforward answer, which right now I don't necessarily see a reason why it should. That said, I do agree with Allison that I think this is broadly going to contribute to the perception that's been growing in Seoul over the last 5 years, which is that South Korea lives in a dangerous neighborhood, obviously, with North Korea on its border, and I think when Kim Jong Un in January 2021 for the first time talked about tactical nuclear weapons, I think threat perceptions in South Korea have accelerated quite rapidly. So in a general sense, I do see this summit and now the anger that we've seen out of the Yongsan presidential office manifesting into the internal debates in South Korea about what Seoul needs to do and what Seoul might need from the United States to feel reassured. So in an abstract sense, while I don't think this really changes the game in terms of how the alliance should think about politically deterring Kim Jong Un from, trying to unify the peninsula with his nuclear deterrent. Of course, he's changed its unification policy now, treating South Korea as a independent hostile state. But I do think when it comes to our alliance consultations within the nuclear consultative group and other mechanisms, I think there will be an increasing set of discussions to be had about what Russia and North Korea cooperation really portends for extended deterrence and the alliance more broadly. But I don't think it fundamentally undermines U.S. credibility, which of course is built on the political commitment we have to South Korea and decades of history, and of course the presence of U.S. service members and citizens on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, we remain self-interested in South Korea's security and the alliance. On non-proliferation, I think, it's really striking, right? I mean, Russia is a depository state of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. At the height of the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, in the 60s, as much as we disagreed about our respective visions for world order, we did agree that a world with more nuclear-armed countries was bad for both of us. And now I think we are seeing a fraying of that consensus on non-proliferation, right? And so North Korea is the only country to have ever withdrawn from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and built nuclear weapons. So I think it matters how the nuclear-armed powers choose to interact with North Korea. And now that Russia has specifically called out peaceful nuclear energy cooperation, which is one of the pillars of the NPT, the grand bargain in the NPT. The idea was essentially that in exchange for countries making a commitment to remain non-nuclear, they will receive access to peaceful nuclear energy technologies. And Russia has now agreed to essentially unconditionally provide that to North Korea without any sort of movement by North Korea towards denuclearization or disarmament. And so I think this is going to be discussed at the upcoming preparatory meeting of the NPT at the next review conference. I think it augurs poorly for how other countries might view Russia's willingness to do business with them on nuclear technology. It, I think, affects how North Korea might potentially return to Kim Jong-il era style of nuclear proliferation, which really we haven't seen under Kim Jong-un. So I do want to remain vigilant to that. I can conjure scenarios where Russian flagged vessels begin to transfer missiles to the junta in Myanmar, where maritime interdiction efforts might be perhaps less successful than they would be against North Korean ships, so on and so forth. So I think this is going to open a new chapter in non-proliferation. But more broadly, Rorry, I think this goes back to that point I made at the beginning, which is that I do think there are still people in the Russian system, at the Kremlin, at the Russian Foreign Ministry, who probably understand why non-proliferation should be an interest for Russia, but their voices are not what matters right now. Vladimir Putin, I think from the very top, has issued a directive to build a strategic partnership with North Korea, which has, again, subjugated non-proliferation to Russia's short-term priorities in Ukraine. So I think until as long as the Ukraine war continues, I don't think we will see Russia in any way being a traditionally collaborative partner with the United States on non-proliferation. The note I do want to end with, though, is, China, I do think, has a substantially different approach to this issue, right? We had the China, Japan, South Korea trilateral summit where the Chinese endorsed denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. My understanding was that China really didn't want to talk about North Korea or Russia. And the North Koreans actually released a statement in their state media criticizing China for that, right? And that's I think fairly notable. I think the Chinese have an interest, despite their strategic competition with the United States, in being perceived more responsibly in international settings on non-proliferation. As much as I disagree with China's technical rationale for criticizing AUKUS, the fact that they do voice a non-proliferation concern publicly on AUKUS continues to, I think, demonstrate that China at least does have an interest in being seen as a productive player on non-proliferation. So I do think it'll be very difficult for the U.S. and China to compartmentalize the Korean Peninsula again. I think the evidence from the last 6-7 years just points in the opposite direction. But to the extent possible, I think it is worth recognizing that when it comes specifically to North Korea's nuclear capabilities and non-proliferation more broadly, I do think Russia and China are singing different tunes at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting as well. I mean, if the logic chain that you described is bought into in Beijing, perhaps that does put some pressure on China to try to be a more active member of the coalition that is trying to end, at least freeze, ceasefire the war in Ukraine, knowing that it would therefore decrease Russia's need to work more closely with North Korea, which might increase China's leverage. That's probably three-dimensional chess, a little bit too far forward for this moment in time, but interesting to think about. Danny, I want to turn to you on recommendations.
Rorry, can I just add something really quickly on China?
Sure.
Just to echo the point, I think, I was in Beijing last fall, and I've sort of kept in touch with, Chinese scholars on this issue. I mean, the sense I get, and you can also see this in Chinese press conferences recently when they're asked about Russia-North Korea cooperation, is they just don't want to talk about this. I think, and I don't know if that's a quirk within the Chinese system where the policy planning that's required to sort of come up with a national policy approach to this rapidly changing relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang just hasn't been completed. But I just don't get the sense that there's an internal coherence right now in what exactly China wants to do about this. And so I do think when we do start to get evidence of that, I think it will be incumbent on U.S. policy planners to recognize if there might be something there where the U.S. and China can actually have something of a productive conversation. Again, I'm skeptical that we will be able to compartmentalize in that way. But if we are serious about limiting Russia-North Korea cooperation, I just don't think we can set China aside.
Yeah, I mean, that's a trend that I think people who follow China closely are observing among many issues, right? There's a bit of policy inertia in Beijing right now. I think that has more to do with domestic politics and political economy. And as you said, the inability of a system where all of the power is concentrated in the top, 1 to 5 leaders to respond rapidly to the changing environment on the ground. Certainly lower level officials in Beijing and in the Chinese system throughout the world aren't sticking their necks out right now to be farther forward than leadership directives on any of these issues, which does make it really difficult to kind of gauge where China's collective head is at. Danny, over to you for your recommendations. If I can also pile on to what will undoubtedly be a useful plan moving forward for the U.S. and the allies. Could you please give us a sense of how Japan might be looking at this as well? Japan is the only member of the 6-party talks who we have not explicitly talked about, and I'd be curious to hear what you think this is looking like in Tokyo, what the U.S. and its allies can do to kind of manage the situation responsibly. Over to you for those thoughts.
Well, starting with Japan, Rorry, I think this is a national nightmare. They are in what Japanese leaders describe as a very difficult environment, security environment to begin with, and any uptick in cooperation between Russia and North Korea makes that environment even more severe for Japan. I alluded to the fact that there are Russian naval exercises underway right now. in and around the Sea of Japan. We've seen joint exercises between Russia and China that the Japanese consider threatening Japan. Has every bit as many concerns about the steadiness of the United States and extended deterrence as perhaps South Korea does. So this is pretty unnerving. Specifically, I think it slams the car door shut right on the fingers of the initiative to broker better North Korea-Japan relations, to create an opening, whether it's for security purposes or for domestic political purposes relating to abductees and so on. The moves that we've seen, the statements we've heard coming out of Tokyo about some outreach to Pyongyang are casualties, I think, of this new development. Similarly, previous Japanese prime ministers have harbored ambitious hopes about progress in the unresolved state of war, frankly, between Russia and Japan. They don't have a defense treaty. They've got a profound territorial disagreement in the Northern Territories. So I think these are all also casualties. In terms of our options, look, the U.S., the Western toolkit hasn't changed. It's basically a recipe made up of some combination of defense, deterrence, diplomacy. But clearly, I think the specter of a Russian-North Korean partnership is going to galvanize, is already galvanizing the West. Specifically, we've got the NATO summit coming up in 2 weeks. Kishida will be there, Yoon will be there. So this really does now bring together the European and the Asian aspects of the threat, driven increasingly now by Russia. It's an obvious forum for working on a collective response. And I think, as others have mentioned, the new comprehensive security partnership coming out of Pyongyang is going to further turbocharge the trilateral U.S., Japan, Korea security relationship, which is already quite robust. And we know that the three countries are very close to finalizing a trilateral security cooperation framework. So, the dream of strengthening and institutionalizing trilateral security cooperation that came out of Camp David, I think, has gotten a big boost. I think beyond that, hopefully, this development is going to motivate an intensified effort to crack down. Allison mentioned the issue of sanctions. I think to crack down on the evasion of sanctions, the sanctions against Russia, the sanctions against North Korea. And personally, I very much hope that it accelerates international efforts to combat Russian and North Korea cybercrime, which is a very, very serious problem, growing problem, and also a major source of revenue for both countries. I think that we can see that Putin's move, and this goes to Ankit's point, that Putin is privileging Ukraine over all other Russian interests, that this is hurting Russia's economic interests. And it's certainly going to hurt its success to date in discouraging South Korea from providing lethal aid directly to Ukraine. Allison made the point that any hopes that South Korea once had about Russia being helpful or Russia being a partner have been dashed. It is critically important for the international community, and certainly these three countries, to impose costs on Putin for encouraging and protecting Kim Jong Un. And I see no reason why Seoul shouldn't provide lethal aid now directly to Ukraine. And I saw that the Korean National Security Advisor Cho already stated that this is an option under consideration. And I would also expect and hope to see South Korea and Japan, for that matter, slash their imports from Russia, which are decreasing anyway. So the last thing I would say is that look, there aren't easy options. They're not good options, certainly in the short term. But when I was in government, I made it a point regularly to remind myself and my colleagues that there's no situation that's so bad that it can't be made worse. And to me, that means that we need to think carefully through the second and third order effect of the choices that we make in responding here, especially to Ankit's point about China perhaps singing a different tune on non-proliferation, about China having an interest, as you and I discussed, about interest in external stability. It's a legitimate question of whether and when it will be time to bolster extended deterrence by, say, moving up the ladder from the Washington Declaration, moving beyond the nuclear consultative group, and thinking about ways to strengthen the nuclear deterrent to protect South Korea and Japan. But we need to be careful. We will always be better off in a dynamic in which it's the other side that sees we have this option and wants to discourage us by moderating their behavior than to exercise the option and incentivize them to retaliate rather than to be restrained. Because there really is a nightmare scenario, although I think as things stand now, it's quite unlikely. But a nightmare scenario if Beijing really pitched in to this comprehensive strategic partnership and this defense arrangement and turned it into a trilateral effort in political terms and technological terms and security terms. That in that circumstance, we would be faced with a truly daunting and unwelcome external environment.
Okay, that is a very robust menu of options, running the gamut from international cooperation, NATO, to combating cybercrime, to just kind of keeping a really good, careful, strategic eye on how moves that the United States and its allies might be perceived. It brings up an interesting question, which is, could we accept any reassurances from Russia and DPRK? Is the absence of bad behavior enough of a reassurance for the U.S. and its allies to kind of mutually manage a de-escalatory cycle? But we'll have to save that for another podcast because we're coming to the end of this. I do want to ask a final lightning round of question to you guys. Each of you in turn will go with Ankit, then Danny, and give the final word to Allison. Just give me 1 to 2 sentences if you can on what you're watching moving forward in the next couple of months, or kind of the big strategic questions that you're asking yourself now.
Sure. So, like I said earlier, I'm watching for evidence of what North Korea is getting technically, because that's what I spent a lot of my time on. On the strategic question, though, I think, look, I mean, I've been critical of our status quo North Korea policy approach for a number of years. I think over the next, probably on the other side of our election, so the next 18 months or so, I do think it's going to be imperative for the U.S., South Korea, and Japan, separately in a bilateral context and trilaterally together, to really undertake a blue sky policy review of what all of this means for our interests on the Korean Peninsula, and I think that encompasses deterrence, it encompasses sanctions, it encompasses our broader approach diplomatically to try to get the North Koreans to once again take an interest in engaging. I think we really need to go back to the drawing board fundamentally.
Thank you. Danny, over to you.
Well, after the prospect of a blue sky soup to nuts review of our approach to North Korea, this is going to sound pretty pedestrian and micro, but I'm watching the issue of Chinese support for Russia's defense industry. And it's an intriguing question as to whether the rapprochement and the defense arrangements, the cooperative arrangements between Moscow and Pyongyang will outlive Moscow's need for reportedly pretty mediocre North Korean munitions and so on. And whether the Chinese might calculate that it's better to get the Russian defense industry up and running on its own steam and reduce its rationale for making nice to North Korea. But conversely, this development may be sufficiently worrisome and off-putting and raise questions in the mind of Chinese strategists about not just stability, but what kind of a relationship they're trying to forge with the United States. That this could be a place where we start seeing that different tune from China.
Thanks, Danny. Allison, over to you for the final word.
Thanks. As Danny said, things could always be worse. So not to end on a negative note, but just our conversation about Russia, what Russia may provide to North Korea. Ankit said he's going to watch that very carefully. You had Putin respond to South Korea saying it might provide lethal weapons to Ukraine by saying Russia would then provide North Korea with high precision new weapons as well. Definitely, I will be watching what an emboldened Kim may do over the next few months, particularly, we have the NATO meeting, as we've just talked about, coming up, and lots of big events this year in our own calendar and other calendars around the world. So, as we all will be watching North Korea, I'll definitely be watching an emboldened Kim and see what he has for us. Just a year ago, we were saying that North Korea wasn't even on the radar, that we weren't even talking about it. And now we are. So hopefully it doesn't take the main space on the off the back burner onto the front burner. But I guess we'll all be watching to see that.
Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your insights here. As developments occur, we'll be sure to get this group back together, check in with you and see what you think. Allison Hooker, Danny Russel, Ankit Panda, thank you very much. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next time.